Hello. In the third of our series of interviews, I'll be talking to Sir Frank Roberts. Sir Frank joined the Foreign Office in 1930 and held a number of high-ranking posts, amongst them ambassadorships in Moscow, Bonn, and Belgrade. Sir Frank, I'd like to begin with the years immediately following World War II. Between 1945 and 47, you served as Britain's acting ambassador to the Soviet Union. At this time, still officially our ally, but actually greatly distrusted and even feared by Western leaders. What was your own view of Soviet intentions? Were they entirely peaceful?
I don't think myself that the Russians ever had any particular intention of marching into Western Europe, but that wasn't the danger. The danger was that Western Europe was then in a very sad state at the end of the war. I mean, leaving aside Germany, which had collapsed completely, France and Italy were in very poor shape, and each of them had very large communist parties and no very strong political structures. And this was less true in the Low Countries and Scandinavia, but I mean, there wasn't any strength in Europe. And militarily speaking, once the American armies had begun to go back and we'd begun to take our troops out too, the strongest military forces in Europe around about the time of the Berlin blockade were the neutrals, the Swedes, the Swiss, and the Yugoslavs. And so the danger was there might have been a communist takeover or moving in that direction in France or in Italy, as there was actually in Prague. But don't forget, Czechoslovakia at that time did not have a communist government. It wasn't within the Warsaw Pact Cominform sort of area, which they neither existed, of course, and there was the Czech government had good relations with Moscow and with the West, but that wasn't good enough for the Russians, and so they encouraged the communists, who were quite strong in Czechoslovakia, to take over and got rid of Beneš and Maastricht, although Beneš was very well placed. I mean, he liked the Russians and wanted to work in with them. And so the danger was that there would be something of that kind happening in Western Europe, which the Russians would then support, and which there'd be no means of dealing with. There was no balance of power in Europe. So it wasn't a question of, is the Red Army all ready to march? I think it was Michael Stewart who said there was nothing to stop them. All they needed to get to the Atlantic coast was boots, because there wasn't much in the way. But that doesn't mean that we were planning that they wanted a military attack. Stalin was a very cautious man, don't forget. He never liked doing anything unless he was pretty sure of succeeding. And again, the whole Russian approach to things was very different from Hitler's. I mean, they would advance wherever if a door was left ajar, they went in. If the door was there, they wouldn't normally break it down. It was rather like oil, sort of seeping in and around. That had always been the Russian way. I mean, how did Russia reach Vladivostok and the Baltic from a tiny principality in Moscow? It wasn't by wars of conquest, it was by this sort of gradual movement. And they were very well placed to continue it. But of course, in the immediate post-war period, they had a very big job in getting the Russian economy going again, and also getting their new satellite countries going. So, I mean, it would have had to be a very promising position from their point of view in Western Europe before they'd have wanted to intervene. But the possibility was there.
Sir Frank, the Berlin crisis in 1948, I'm talking about the Soviet blockade and the subsequent Anglo-American airlift, marked a significant turning point in East-West relations. It also demonstrated to the Russians and to the Berliners the extent to which the West would go to honor its commitments to Germany. From the point of view of a key participant, could you give me some of your own recollections?
Well, it was, of course, really the year that decided, the move away from the very genuine attempts to keep the wartime alliance going in some shape or form and the move into the Cold War. I think one just has to explain how the Berlin blockade came about very briefly, because what had happened was that by the end of 1946, both the American government and, of course, the British under Ernie Bevin, who had a much more sort of realistic view of Russia than the Americans had at that time, had come to the conclusion that it was going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to continue to run Germany successfully and to turn Germany into a normal economy again in cooperation. And so throughout 47, we were building up Western Europe on the lines of the Marshall Plan, and felt that we had to do two things to make the Marshall Plan work. This was really Ernie Bevin's policies. One was to bring West Germany into it, because without West Germany the other economies were not going to be strong enough. And secondly, we had to do something on the security front to ensure that the populations of Western Europe would feel safe in going ahead with all these policies, which were not necessarily going to be very welcome to the Russians. Well, that brought us into, of course, uniting the Western zones in Germany, British and American first of all, French later on, all the time trying to see whether we could still keep in touch with the Russians. But that meant moving into an administration and then a West German government. And this was really the thing that Stalin did not want. Again, at that time, we were offering the Russians and all the Eastern European countries full membership of the benefits of the Marshall Plan, the OECD and all that. And the Czechs and the Poles came in the hope that they would be allowed to. And Stalin said no, he didn't want to be involved in anything under American leadership. So it became very difficult to go on the basis of a joint attempt to improve the economies of Western Europe. And then there came the critical point of the turning of the currency in West Germany into what became the solid Deutschmark. And once you decided you had to do that in West Germany, the problem was, what did you do in Berlin? Of which 3 of the zones of Berlin were run on Western lines with Western-type currencies. From the Russian point of view, of course, this meant a break in the four-power organization. And this led to the blockade. The Russians, first of all, pulling out of the Allied Control Council, which still ran Germany, theoretically, all Germany. Then suddenly it was discovered that it was difficult for barges to use the canals, and the railways had troubles, and the roads needed repairing, and all the surface routes into Berlin were unusable. It wasn't declared as a blockade, it was just difficulties that arose. And the only way left in without interruption was the air. And people tend to forget, it's always described as an American airlift. In fact, it was 1/3 British and 2/3 American. And we did most of the dirty work in taking the dirty cargoes in flying boats and things like that. So we played our full part, apart from having started it all. But, of course, the price that was paid for that was that it was, in a way... We then went to negotiate in Berlin. I was the British negotiator, because our ambassador was ill, with Stalin, to see whether we could reach an agreement. And it became very clear in these negotiations that it wasn't a matter of the currency against lifting what the Russians never called a blockade, but these transport problems. The real problem was, Stalin said it to us twice, if we would either give up altogether or delay introducing a West German government, then everything could be settled. But of course it was the one thing we couldn't do, and we said no, and so we relied on the airlift. And the RAF and the Americans put on a wonderful show. Again, we played much more than our role, because it was the British airfields in Germany from which all the planes had to come, because the American airfields were much further away. So we did rather more than our third. And in the course of the airlift, we lost more and more people. In the airlift memorial in Tempelhof, I think it's about 40 British dead. I mean, not shot down, but who died in accidents and so on, and about 30-odd Americans. So it was an Anglo-American thing. The French were not involved, they hadn't got the planes. And so after a year or so, or about 8 months, Stalin decided that he must give it up. They weren't winning, and they were losing a lot politically. And so the airlift, the blockade was lifted. But of course, that was the start of the Cold War, without any question. But it was also the start of this new relationship with the Germans. It was also, of course, a very important thing for the start of the Atlantic Alliance and NATO, because it was the first time it had been shown that even in an area where the Russians were, strictly speaking, in control, because in Berlin, obviously, they were in control, and our garrison in Berlin could not have lasted more than a day if it had come to fighting, that nevertheless we could hold our own if it came to a struggle with the Russians, and that they would give way rather than us. So from every point of view, it was enormously important.
Sir Frank, during this very difficult period of rising international tensions, the discovery that the Russians possessed their own nuclear capability came as a shock to the British establishment. They also undoubtedly possessed very good intelligence of British and American military capabilities and intentions. In your opinion, how helpful to the Russians was the information they received from men like Guy Burgess, Kim Philby, and Donald Maclean?
I would leave out of this Guy Burgess, because frankly, I don't think they ever got any very useful information of this kind from him. They would have got useful information, I think, on these kind of subjects from Donald Maclean, because Donald had been in Washington and actually was working, I believe, with the Americans on nuclear questions. But that was at the end of the war. Then he went off to Egypt, where he was out of touch with all this kind of thing, but then came back to be head of the American department in the Foreign Office, which, although it wasn't quite as important as the name would imply, because most of the major things were done, as for example, German affairs were in the Central Department and so on. But nevertheless, he would have had a lot of information on this, and I suppose he passed a certain amount of it on.
Going back a bit, Sir Frank, during the war you served in the Central Department of the Foreign Office, and you had dealings with both Philby, who was in Section 5 of MI6, and John Cairncross, who you worked with quite closely, and who was finally unmasked by Oleg Gordievsky as the fifth man in the Cambridge spy ring. What were your impressions of Cairncross, first of all?
Cairncross came into the Central Department. He'd passed the Foreign Office exam top, I think, and had come in as a very bright chap, as it were, from university. And I was the sort of, at that time, just above him, as it were, and so I was the one who was supposed to teach him, you know, how you did the work in the Foreign Office. And frankly, he was, although this wonderful background, as it were, of academic skill, he was extremely inefficient, I mean, by any standards. And after about 6 months, I mean, I couldn't get him, and I wasn't a hard taskmaster particularly. I had to say, he's never going to be any good in the Foreign Office. He just hasn't got the feel for the work here. And so I don't know quite when it came, whether it was after a year or after a shorter time, but he was transferred by general agreement to the Home Civil Service. And I think went into the Treasury. But I mean, I said, good riddance, thank goodness we haven't got Cairncross there. But I mean, not because we thought he was a communist spy, just because we thought he was damned inefficient and not good enough. So it's rather odd to find him later described as a highly skillful operator. So I didn't see through him. But I don't think, honestly, he was putting this on, because, I mean, why should he? obvious tactics would have been to be an efficient officer, and generally accepted, as Maclean had been. Now, going to Philby, that's a much more important thing. Of course, Philby was then the idea has got about that he was very high up in the Secret Service at that time, but he wasn't very high up. I mean, after all, I was only an acting councillor, head of a department in the Foreign Office, with plenty of undersecretaries ahead on top of me. And Philby used to do his business with me. I mean, so we were roughly the same thing. And our business was obviously, we had the same interests, which was usually trying to blow up German ships in Spanish harbours. And he would have to come to me, and say, we've got a plan to blow up a ship in the Canaries or somewhere. And is it all right diplomatically to do that in the present climate? And sometimes I would say, yes, go ahead, and sometimes I would say, well, wait a minute, the timing isn't quite right. So there was no particular reason to have problems with Philby, because after all, we were both wanting to do the same thing. And so that was my only connection with Philby, until very, very much later, when I happened to be, I think I was then an undersecretary in the Foreign Office in the early 50s, and it had been decided finally to get rid of Philby and to allow him to find a job outside Whitehall. And of course, we in the Foreign Office very often were called upon to sign letters because the Secret Service people wanted to keep their anonymity, and even things that, very frankly, we knew very little about. And there was a letter to the Observer, which, to sort of commend is perhaps not quite the right word, but say, no objection to your employing Philby, or words to that effect, which I had signed. I'd forgotten all about it until I opened the Observer one day and suddenly saw my signature, you see, commending Philby. I thought, oh God, why did I ever do this?
But of course, Philby's defection was only one of a series of damaging blows to the British Intelligence Service and to the Foreign Office. The defection of Burgess and Maclean, coming much earlier and without any sort of warning, must have had a greater impact on the service.
Well, it came as rather a shock, because we had been a rather small service where we felt we all knew each other more or less and had confidence in each other. And it was after that security, much tighter security, had to be introduced, which rather interfered with that, what you might call almost family relationship or club relationship. And to that extent was a shock. And a shock that, I mean, Guy Burgess is a slightly different case, and even Philby, but Donald Maclean was a real shock, because he was a very promising and top rising member of the Foreign Service, with a very reliable sort of background. Guy was a quite different thing, who we had never wanted to have in the service at all. He was never a member of the service. He'd been in, I forget, various other things during the war, and then got involved and put into the embassy in Washington. The Americans declared him persona non grata because his driving around Washington was extremely dangerous. And we wanted to say, thank you very much, that's enough. But the then Minister of State in the Foreign Office, Hector McNeill, who was a very bright and rising Labour politician, who I think might have become Foreign Secretary, he rather took the view that it was good for the Foreign Office to have bright chaps from outside sort of giving us new ideas. And he thought he'd like, so we rather said, well, would you like to take Guy Burgess? And to our great surprise, he said, yes, I'd like him as my private secretary, which was very, very sad business. And I saw quite a lot of Guy, because, not I hasten to say, in his orgies in Bentinck Street, I wasn't invited to those, but because I was private secretary to Bevin, who was Foreign Secretary, and he was private secretary to Hector McNeill, who was very close to Bevin, and so we had to do a lot of work together. I always found that any course of action he suggested, you should automatically reject, because he was always wrong-headed. But I didn't discover that he was a communist. But he was a very odd fish, and he was always so dirty, and you always felt he'd, which I think was often the case, that he'd gone to bed in his clothes and got up the next morning without having shaved or done anything at all. He was a very strange creature. But he wasn't, I mean, he hadn't got background information very much. But poor Hector McNeill, of course, was terribly shaken by it all. And he died rather young shortly after that, and I think it had an effect.
Sir Frank, I'd like to finish up with your second posting to Moscow. You would have been acquainted with Oleg Penkovsky and the immense value of the information he was supplying to the British. Could you tell me a little about this period?
I think one has to first of all say that I went back as ambassador in 1960, and I was there from 60 to 62. So I was there for the Berlin Wall and the Missile Gap and Penkovsky. But of course, looking back on it all, I think the most important feature was really Khrushchev, with a small L, liberalizing the old Stalinist regime. He didn't remove all the horrors. By any manner of means, there were still psychiatric camps and all that. But he opened up all the concentration camps, and Russians no longer slept at night with suitcases packed lest they might be shot off to Siberia tomorrow morning. I mean, he made life very different for the Russians. And in a time which was much more dangerous, because Beria had been shot, but it might well have been Khrushchev who would come out badly. So he was doing a very good job inside Russia, making life much more tolerable for the Russians, and indeed going around the world and, as it were, seeing other countries and all the rest of it. But of course, Khrushchev was a very un-Russian sort of character in many ways, because he jumped into things. He wasn't, the Russians are rather typical chess players who play the game slowly and don't make moves until they're quite sure about them. But Khrushchev was extremely ebullient, and he suddenly had bright ideas and went dashing off in all kinds of directions, sometimes very dangerous, and without ever quite seeing the consequences of where he was getting to. And I think this was true of both these major foreign affairs things. I'll come to Penkovsky later. Both the second Berlin crisis and the missile crisis, because he'd started the Berlin crisis. I mean, before I went to Russia in 1959, he wanted somehow to get us out of Berlin. Above all, he wanted to enable the German Democratic Republic to acquire a sort of independent position in the world, which was very hard to do when all their best people were escaping to the West through Berlin all the time. See, Berlin was an open city. If anybody from the DDR got into Berlin, they could take the next plane and come to Moscow, which they were all doing. And as Khrushchev said to me once, he said, "I don't know what you would think if all your blood was being squeezed out of you." See? And then he thought, well, the West can't be very happy about having to stay in Berlin and keep troops there. We must find a solution which will be attractive to them. And he found the solution of a United Nations presence in Berlin. But very plainly, the Berliners much preferred the effective protection of the Americans, plus the British and the French, to some sort of uncertain Berlin thing. So we were not playing for that one. And he got into great difficulties, and he'd been trying to give more power to the DDR, but at the same time not leave them in charge of their own affairs. He wanted still to have the control. But he was always threatening us, you see, with turning the DDR into a fully independent state, and then we would have to deal with them, which we were not ready to do. But in the end, of course, he couldn't get us to agree to any of these things, and so the wall was the solution. And it was a typical Khrushchev solution in a way, because it didn't look much of a victory. In fact, it looked quite the reverse when he was shutting people into Berlin and not letting them get out. But he did achieve his objective, which was to prevent the most useful elements in the East German population from leaving. And so he was able, as he said, to deal with this painful tooth in my mouth. That was how he used to put it to me. So it wasn't an entire failure, the war, from his point of view, although it looked like it. But of course it did mean that from then on, the West Germans had to think of accepting the DDR as a fact of life and getting to terms with it, whereas previously their line had been, we don't recognize the DDR, it doesn't exist, and any country which recognizes the DDR we break relations with. and they moved into the other field of Brandts-Ostpolitik gradually. But then you came to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think that again was another typical Khrushchev operation, when he felt, first of all, Cuba was in danger because the Americans had already, in the Bay of Pigs, you see, tried to send people to get rid of Castro. It had failed. And that at any moment they might do something else of the same kind. And so he had somehow to defend the Cubans. They didn't like the Cubans very much, but still they were the only communist country in the Americas and couldn't just be left to their own fate. Then again he had another thing in his mind, which was that Russia was then threatened by long-distance nuclear weapons from Italy and from Turkey and from Scotland, where we now are. And he wanted somehow to remove that threat to Russia. And he put the two things together in a rather vague way. And so he raised the stakes, you see, a lot, and sent missiles to Cuba. Now, I'm quite sure that he expected the Americans to find out what he was doing. He didn't expect it to be secret. He thought, he more or less said this to me, he was expecting to go to Washington for the United Nations and discuss important matters. He expected the Americans to complain and refer the matter to the United Nations. What he'd never expected was that the Americans would stop his ships at sea. And I remember I was leaving Russia shortly after that, and there was a new American ambassador. So we were seeing a great deal of the top Russians at farewell parties and arrival parties and so on. And they used to come gibbering up to me and say, but Mr. Ambassador, you represent a naval power. You must realize that interfering with ships at sea is like an act of war. Rather forgetting that if anybody had interfered with ships at sea at that time, it was us. But never mind. And so this has put the whole thing out, you see. And the whole plan had got into a very dangerous situation. And his people obviously were very worried about his having got them into this dangerous situation. Because unlike the Berlin crisis, I mean, the Berlin crisis, at least the Russians were the power in Berlin, but they weren't the power in the Caribbean at all. And not at sea. I mean, they were getting into a completely false position. And so he had somehow to climb down. And he'd never meant it to be a real threat to world peace or anything. It seemed like that from outside, and above all in America. But if you were in Moscow, I mean, during the last week of the crisis, which was the key week, there was nothing in the Russian papers about this. The Russian reader of the papers wouldn't have imagined there was a crisis. And this was the time when Kennedy was in 24-hour session with all his advisors. But what was Khrushchev doing? He was going to see Boris Godunov, 5-hour opera, because there was an American singer in it, and then inviting him to supper afterwards. All this to be reported in Pravda, to give the suggestion that everything was very well with relations with America. And it wasn't until the Thursday of the week that the Russians got the first idea that there was a crisis. And they got it in the form of the publication on the front page of Pravda of a message from Bertrand Russell to Khrushchev asking him to save the peace of the world. And Khrushchev, of course, replied, he was very too happy to save the peace of the world. But before that, no Russian knew there was any threat to the peace of the world. And meanwhile, of course, Khrushchev, at just about that time, had sent his letter to Kennedy, climbing down. Then there came the real danger, which was, obviously somebody said to Khrushchev, "You've sold the horse too cheap. You forgot to mention the American missiles in Turkey and Italy and Scotland." And so a second message was sent off, which was obviously, the first one had obviously been drafted by Khrushchev, it was his sort of style and everything. The second was a much more formal sort of document. And when it reached the Americans, they at first thought they were being double-crossed. There was something wrong. And it was then that Kennedy's brother, Robert, really did save the peace of the world, I think, in a way, by saying, but Jack, hadn't we better reply to the first message and ignore the second, which is what they did.
So, Frank, you certainly raised a number of fascinating points, but what about Penkovsky?
That's another side to it, yes. Penkovsky was a Georgian, oddly enough, a senior official in what was very important. It wasn't a ministry, but it was the Committee for Scientific something or other. It was a very important and rather prestigious Russian organization whose main objective was to, through espionage and every other kind of thing, to get scientific information from foreign governments. And so they had to hobnob a lot with foreigners. And the leader of it was a man called Vishyani, who was the son-in-law of the then Prime Minister Kosygin, a rather important man. And Penkovsky, for some reason, his father-in-law was a general who was dealing in the nuclear side, and he had all the nuclear information about what the Russian strength was, how many missiles they had, how far they'd got, and all this kind of thing. And I can't remember exactly why. He said, well, I think he suddenly felt that Khrushchev was very dangerous and that something must be done to stop something going wrong. I mean, not through necessary policy, but in other ways. And he tried very hard to get in touch with some of the Western governments, and he used to meet them at parties in Moscow. But the Americans somehow were suspicious. He was too senior an official. The Canadians, who he tried to get hold of, and then he tried us. And we were either naive or something, but we did respond. And we had this strange businessman, Greville Wynne, who could be put in touch with him. And it turned out that he really had absolutely vital information of the Russian nuclear strength at that time. And of course that was the time when Khrushchev was telling the whole world that Russia was ahead of America in space, which they were. I mean, they just sent up the first Sputnik and all that kind of thing, and suggesting that they were equal in strength in nuclear power, which they weren't, but nobody knew, excepting Penkovsky gave us the statistics. And he wasn't an ordinary spy. He didn't want to be paid. And he did travel abroad in the course of his business. So he was able to come to London and be seen by our people in London. And he wanted to be given military rank in the British Army, so that he would feel that he was doing an honourable task and not just a foreign spy. And I think he was given the honorary rank of lieutenant colonel or something, which corresponded with his rank in America. Anyway, to cut a long story short, when the crisis came, of course, we and the Americans knew the Russian nuclear strength, and we knew it was far less than ours, far less than the American, I mean, basically, and that therefore, if it came to a game of chicken, it wasn't. It was the Russians who would chicken first, because they hadn't enough, especially as it was all in Cuba anyway. So this was really very, very important, and I think the Penkovsky thing was almost more important than nearly all the Russian espionage successes. But it was one of our very few, and I don't think we had much merit in it. It was Penkovsky who was insisting on giving us the information.
So, Frank, thank you very much.